Hello and welcome to Aero Innovations. I'm Aero and I'll be your host this evening. If you're new to the channel, I'm a low stakes specialist who goes in depth to explain every notable hand I play and the thinking process that goes behind how I play them. If you're looking to crush low stakes, no limit hold'em, then you've come to the right place. Tonight I have something special for you guys. You're looking at a double header. I start with one of my classic 2-5 deep stack episodes, but then immediately after, we jump into a 1-3 session where I limit myself to only 100 big blinds. I have often preached on my channel that you shouldn't mimic some of my techniques, mainly a lot of my fancy bluffs, and some of my hand selection if your normal game is a 1-3 game or you're playing a 2-5 with a 100 big blind structure. I have often been asked to showcase such a game, since I think most of my audience are actually 1-3 players. Stick around for the second half of this video and you will get exactly that. In the meantime, let's jump right into the action. As usual, we're playing 2-5 no limit hold'em at the Wynn Encore in Las Vegas, where I bind for 1,500, which is 300 big blinds. It's Saturday night on February the 9th, although technically Sunday morning, since we don't start until 12:13 in the morning. The very first hand I get dealt, there's a live 10. The middle position opens for 30 with a full stack of 1,500. The low jack calls. I call in the hijack with king jack offsuit, and the straddle calls as well. We go 4 ways in position to a flop of king, king, 8, rainbow. We flop trip kings with a mediocre kicker, which is pretty darn nice for our first hand. The middle position c-bets another stale bet of 30. The low jack folds. This is an extremely tiny bet into a multi-way pot. I think it's a feeler bet. Most players would take this opportunity to put in a raise against such a weak bet. It can be argued you're denying equity to small pocket pairs that might call to utterly destroy your trips if they hit. And while this is true, an advanced player has the ability to fold even such a hand as trips in the event something like that happens. It's also possible our opponent could have us beat at this point with a hand like queen-king or ace-king. This board is incredibly dry. There are no straight or flush draws present. If you have your opponent beat on a board like this, they're only drawing to 2 or 3 outs. Plus, we do have position. So rather than telegraph the strength of our hand, I like to just make the flat call here. The straddle folds, so we go heads up to a turn, which brings in a 9 of diamonds, putting 2 diamonds on board. This time, our opponent checks. Okay, now the board is much more dynamic. Hands like 10-jack and jack-queen both have gut-shot draws, and there's also a backdoor flush draw available as well. We're in real bad shape against a hand like pocket 9s though. I suspect our opponent has some sort of pocket pair, so let's just hope it isn't pocket 9s. I shoot out a tentative bet of $100. I'm targeting hands such as pocket 10s or pocket jacks, or possibly a hand like ace-8 suited. If we meet resistance here in the form of a check raise, we're going to have to play this hand very carefully moving forward. Thankfully, our opponent just calls. I think queen-king or ace-king would have raised at this point, so we're most likely good. The river brings in a queen of clubs. 10-jack makes a straight, but I think such a hand is out of the realm of plausibility, unless it happens to be 10-jack of diamonds. And even then, that's a pretty far stretch to c-bet on that flop. So when our opponent checks over to us for a second time, I target the aforementioned hands like 10s or jacks, and maybe even a hand like king 10 suited, and shoot out a bet of 150 into the pot of 385. Against this bet, our opponent tanks. It would really suck for him if all we had was a random naked 8 in this spot, wouldn't it? That's probably what he's thinking. I mean, we smooth called his $30 bet on the flop. Wouldn't a king have raised there? Then again, why would an 8 bet the turn and then again on this river when a hand like that has showdown value? So either I have a king or I have air. With these thoughts in mind, our opponent eventually comes to the right decision and puts in the fold. 30 minutes later, the under the gun and low jack players limp. The hijack raises to 30, which is a larger than normal raise amount. He's the same opponent from our last hand. I'm sitting here in the small blind with ace-queen of diamonds. Normally, this is just a slam dunk 3-bet, and I would have done so this time as well had our opponent used a smaller raise amount, like 20 or 25. But since he very specifically chose 30, I can tell he's accounted for the 2 limpers, which means he has a premium hand as opposed to a speculative hand like suited connectors. Sure, GTO pros raise the same amount regardless of their hand strength, but when you're playing in the low stakes, you're not dealing with a whole lot of GTO pros. Most people are pretty face up with how strong their hand is with regards to their raise amount. So since I'm out of position and I think I'm dealing with a pretty damn strong hand like jacks or above, and maybe a hand like ace-king, I just smooth call. everyone else folds. So we go heads up, out of position, to flop of 2, 5, 9, with 2 diamonds and a club. Very nice. We flop the nut flush draw with 2 overcards to the board. So I start with a check. Our opponent proceeds with a 2/3 pot bet of $50. Okay, see the strength of that bet? I was right. We're dealing with a definite overpair here. Had our opponent proceeded with a half pot bet or below, he could have disguised the strength of his hand. If I just had some middling pocket pair here like 7s or 8s, I wouldn't even bother calling this c-bet. Out of position, I'm not about to just check call my hand though. We have the nut flush draw, and our ace is most likely good. So those 12 outs gives us approximately 42 to 45% against our opponent, depending upon if he has a diamond or not. If he only has 10s or jacks, we're actually a favorite to win this hand. We would gain 3 more outs for our queen. So that would give us between 14 and 15 outs against a hand like 10s or jacks. That's just the mathematics of our relative hand strength. However, I'm going to choose to play my hand aggressively and potentially utilize some fold equity. So I check raise to 150. Our opponent quickly makes the call, which I suspected he would. We're not trying to get him to fold just yet. We don't want that to happen until the river, assuming we don't hit. So the turn comes, and it brings in a 3 of hearts. It's not a diamond, but it does give us an additional 3 outs to hit a gut shot straight. I continue with a pretty strong, but not overpowering, bet of 250. With this bet sizing, I'm leaving our opponent enough behind to potentially fold to a river jam. There's almost no chance he'll fold to us for the bet sizing we're using on the turn, especially when the board hasn't changed all that much, unless we're very specifically holding ace-4 of diamonds. I mean, if he, as we suspect, has an overpair here, it's still just a 9-high board. He's only realistically losing to a set. So as predicted, our opponent makes the call, leaving a stack of about 800 behind. So far, so good. Right now, everything is going according to plan. Now, we just need the river to obey. We need a 4 for a straight, a diamond will give us the nut flush, an ace will most likely be good, a queen may or may not be good, but I'll definitely be using a king as a scare card if it hits. A 9 would also be great to use as a scare card as well. However, a 2 or a 5 would be horrifically bad. It'll reduce the odds we actually flopped a set, so we don't want one of those. A 10 or a jack would also be terrible because it's in the range of hands that might give our opponent top set. On any other small card, I plan to shove, because we could have plausibly played this hand with a combo draw with a hand like 6-7 of diamonds or something similar. In other words, I'm shoving here on most rivers. So the river comes, and it's the ace of hearts. We hit one of our much desired outs. Unless our opponent is holding pocket aces here with the last 2 remaining aces, we're most likely good. Keep in mind I'm using logic here to deduce our opponent's most plausible hands. I'm not always right, but I am right enough to be a very profitable professional poker player. Also, this ace may have been the key to victory, but unfortunately it's much less likely to get us paid. If we didn't actually have an ace here, it'd be one of the cards I'd use as a scare card. Okay, so now I have a few choices. I can check and feign weakness to that ace, but our opponent would most likely check back his hand, unless he gets super greedy and goes for ultra thin value. I can go for a value bet size of about 3 to 400. The pot's already 875 though, and even a bet of only 3 to 400 will still be a good portion of our opponent's stack. If we want a definite call here, we'd have to go for a tiny size of like another stale 250, or even backtrack a little bit and bet like 200. However, since this is the same opponent as our last hand, he could potentially still be upset about having to fold that hand and never getting to see ours. If that thought is still lurking in the back of his head, he might lean more towards a hero call here. If our flush draw was more of a hand like 6-7 of diamonds, we'd definitely use this ace as a scare card for a shove. So let's see if our opponent wants to put on a cape tonight and be a hero. I decide to get greedy and go for an all-in shove. Our opponent tanks, and tanks, and then tanks some more. After almost a full 2 minutes, he says he's heavily leaning towards folding. I tell him I slow played pocket queens since I was out of position, and then I show him my queen of diamonds. I figure if I show him the queen of diamonds, he'll never put me on a hand as strong as ace queen of diamonds that didn't go for a 3-bet pre-flop. Upon seeing this, our opponent tanks some more. Over a minute and a half passes before he eventually puts in the fold. Okay, so in this case, we actually wanted a hero call, but let's say the river was a random king instead of our much needed ace. it would have worked out perfectly good as a scare card, and we would have gotten away with a much desired fold all the same. So I found out later from someone standing behind our opponent that he actually had pocket queens there, which is pretty much in that region of an overpair smaller than an ace or a king that I suspected he had. Once I showed him that queen of diamonds, he would only be losing to one of two hands, either queen four of diamonds, which would require that I be a maniac playing that sort of garbage from the small blind to a $30 raise, or exactly ace queen of diamonds. The fact that he folded pocket queens to me there, after I revealed the queen of diamonds, was a pretty damn stellar fold. Not gonna lie. Hey, if you're watching this video right now, know that you made not one, but two great folds against me tonight. Of all the potential hands that had him beat, like all the sets, strange two pairs, straights, and a random ace from space, I reduced all of those possibilities down to only one exact hand when I revealed my queen of diamonds. He's getting slightly over 2-1 on his money, and only one exact hand has him beat there, instead of the plethora of other possibilities. This should have provoked him to call. So either our opponent had an exact read on me, or we could have gotten away with a shove with a ton of different scare cards on the river as originally planned. Obviously, if the river had been different, I wouldn't have shown him any cards, and left them to his imagination as to what hands have him beat. Here, under the gun opens to 20 with a $400 stack. The cutoff calls. I call in the small blind with 3-4 of clubs, and the big blind calls as well. We go 4 ways out of position to a flop of 7 ace deuce with 2 clubs. We flop a straight flush draw. The action checks around to the under the gun player who c-bets for 45. The cutoff folds. I take my time before calling, careful not to give away any timing tells. We are never folding here to a half pot bet with a straight flush draw. But we don't want our opponent to know that. By me taking a couple of seconds, I could be deliberating any number of potential hands to call with, or maybe even a hand strong enough to check raise with. Don't take too long and hold up the game though. A couple of seconds should suffice. I decide not to raise because our opponent bet into multiple opponents. He also has a short stack, so he's less likely to fold to aggression. If I check raise here, he might just stick in the rest of his stack, and I'd be forced to call while being an underdog due to being pot committed. We do not want that. So I think a call here is the most profitable decision. Here, the big blind folds. So we go heads up to a turn, which is a 7 of diamonds, pairing the board. This doesn't help us at all, so I check. Thankfully, our opponent checks the action back. The river is a 6 of spades. I'm sitting here with freaking 4 high. However, our opponent could be afraid of that 7. I mean, I could very easily have a 7 here when I called the half pot bet on the flop. Plus, our opponent has a very short stack. I highly doubt he wants to risk the majority of his stack when he's only invested $60 into this pot. So I shoot out a terrifying bet of 225 into the pot of 170. Our opponent quickly makes the fold, so we get this one through. 10 minutes later, the low jack posts his missing blinds. The hijack limps. I'm sitting here with my least favorite premium starting hand. Oh yes, we're talking about the accursed pocket kings. Due to the 2 limpers, I up my raise size to 35. Yes, this is the same tactic our opponent used with the pocket queens earlier. And another exploitative pro might recognize this as a very strong hand I'm raising with. But the vast majority of low stakes players don't pay attention to stuff like that. Plus, I don't necessarily have a big overpair here. I could have a hand like ace-jack suited, ace-queen, or ace-king for instance. So for this price point, the button calls, but everyone else folds. The flop comes, and it's a beauty. It's 3-7-4, all clubs. I double check our hand and notice we are in fact carrying the king of clubs. No, we didn't flop a set, but the board is so small that it leaves room for a host of overpairs, which we absolutely crush and cremate considering we're holding the king of clubs. We actually even have pretty decent outs against a flop set. So I start with a very tiny c-bet of another stale 35. This price point allows for a host of dominated hands to continue, including a jack or queen high flush draw for instance. As predicted, our opponent makes the call. The turn is an inconsequential looking jack of spades. If our opponent had a hand like ace-jack or jack-queen with a club, this card is going to doom him. So I up my bet amount, but not too significantly. I bet another 85 into the pot of 155. Suddenly, our opponent shoves for his entire remaining stack of about 400. I snap call. I mean, we wanted that action. We were hoping for that action. If our opponent flopped a set or a flush, as long as it's not the nut flush, we still have quite a few outs to improve. So the river comes, and it's a 10 of clubs. That could be either really good or really bad, but more likely good than bad, I think. Our opponent says that card most likely killed his hand. I say, yeah, that's probably true. I still wait for him to show his hand though. We've been slow rolled before in a previous vlog, so I don't want to be made a fool of for a second time. Our opponent says he has a set. So I say, then yeah, I definitely got lucky on the river. Eventually, he flips over his hand to reveal pocket tens for the river set. Bro, you shipped it in with pocket tens on a jack-high monotone board without a single club. You got snap called, but you think the river is what killed you? It's a good thing we were carrying the king of clubs, though. I table our hand for the winner. For educational value, if I did not have the king of clubs, I probably would have just check called the turn instead of leading twice. And then on the river, I would have no choice but to check and then fold to any bet. It's a full hour before we play our next notable hand. We can't get greedy though, because up until this point, we've won every big hand we've played. So for this hand, the hijack limps. I limp in the cutoff with 6-7 of diamonds. The button raises to a meek $15, which is definitely a pot builder all day long, especially after 2 limpers. The big blind and hijack call, so of course I call as well. We go 4 ways to a flop of 4, queen, 3, with 2 diamonds and a club. We flop a flush draw with a gut shot to a straight draw as well. This is an above average flop for our hand holding. The action checks around to the button, who puts in a 3/4 c-bet to 45. The big blind and hijack players fold. Okay, so we know our opponent only has a pot sweetener type of hand. He may or may not have even hit this flop, and if he did hit the flop, he probably has some weak-suited queen, or a mediocre queen at best. So instead of just calling, hoping to hit, and most likely not getting paid even if we do hit, unless it happens to be a miracle 5 for the invisible gut shot straight, I figure there's a high probability we can probably take this pot right here and now. So I put in the good old-fashioned check raise to 150. Surely enough, our opponent folds in less than 10 seconds, so we snatch this pot without needing to improve. Fair warning, this next hand is about to get really spicy. This hand happens a couple of minutes after the last hand. Several of our players are lobbying. I consider getting up and taking a short break as well, since we're currently only 4-handed, and I'm not a short-handed specialist. Instead, I decided to just play through the small blind, and then take a break after the button. So here, the other 2 players fold. I normally chop, but since we're only 4-handed, that's the point at which I normally play blind versus blind. So, sitting here with queen 9 of clubs, I figure a $20 raise is appropriate. Our opponent makes the call in the big blind. So the flop comes, and it couldn't possibly be any prettier. It's 8-10 jack, with 2 clubs and a spade. We flop the stone cold absolute nuts. We have the nut straight, and we're also open-ended to improve with a straight flush redraw. I start with a down bet to $10, since I don't think we have a whole lot to be afraid of here. To our surprise, our opponent raises us to 45, with a stack of about 1,200. Oh my gosh, I'm salivating. This is a heads-up blind versus blind hand. Our opponent doesn't need a whole lot to raise us here. He could have top pair, drawing pretty close to dead. He could have an open-ended draw, which is drawing to a chop at best, or possibly even a dominated flush draw. He might even have 2 pairs here a small percentage of the time as well. A set, however, is highly doubtful, since every pocket pair that makes a set should have 3-bet me pre-flop. In one of the best case scenarios, our opponent could have a hand like 9-7 for a dominated straight. So there's no real reason for me to raise here. So I just make the call. The turn is a king of hearts, not changing a whole lot other than the fact that we've been demoted to the second nuts. I put in another check. Surprising us yet again, our opponent throws out a massive pot-sized bet of 120. Okay, so he's saying he's not afraid of the king. I mean, we do lose to ace-queen here, but that's a pretty big stretch. Even so, we have 9 outs to improve, and an additional 2 outs to chop if an ace hits the river that's not a club. We beat all of our opponent's aforementioned hands, like 2 pairs, 9-7, or a hand like jack-king. So I spring my trap and put in the check raise to 315. Our opponent goes all in. At this point, I hope he has 9-7. I mean, there is some chance he hit a 3-outer here with ace-queen, but with only 1150 in his stack, this is just a snap call. It's only barely just over 800 more for me to call. I dominate a crap load of hands, only lose to one specific hand, and I still have outs versus that one hand. So of course, I make the call. But unfortunately, some way, somehow, our opponent flips over ace freaking queen for the one hand that puts us in bad shape. The river is another black king, but it's the king of spades. We don't improve. Not only did our opponent hit the 3 outs he needed to beat us, he actually hit it twice. This loss cleans out all of our profits, putting us in the negatives for the first time today. Stuck 50 doll hairs. The guy who doubled up through me in the last hand leaves, so our table breaks, and we get moved to a new full table before the start of this hand. It's been 30 minutes. Here I open to 15 in the hijack with king 10 of diamonds. The cutoff, small blind, and big blind all call, so we go four-handed to flop a 2, 9, jack, with 2 clubs and a diamond. We flop a gut shot draw, with 1 overcard, and a backdoor diamond draw as well. The action checks to me. With a few sneaky draws and a board that's not super coordinated or likely for someone to have flopped 2 pairs, I throw out a half-pot c-bet of $30. Only the big blind calls. The turn is the best card we could have hoped for without actually making anything. It's an 8 of diamonds, improving our hand to an open-ended straight draw, a flush draw, and an overcard. We just gained absolutely massive equity. So when our opponent checks again, I increase the pressure to a near pot-sized bet of $100. Fully prepared to throw out a massive overbet if we miss the river. Thankfully, it never gets to that, as our opponent makes the fold. So again, we take this one down without needing to actually hit. This is just another example of how I utilize fold equity to gain an advantage with our high equity draws. For the last hand of the session, under the gun limps. I check with 6-3 of hearts in the small blind, and the big blind checks as well. So we go 3-handed in a limp pot to flop a 5, 7, 9 rainbow. I actually flop a very sneaky double gutter. I need a 4 for the invisible straight and an 8 for a very obvious straight. Let's see if my opponents will let me steal this pot with 6 high. I lead for $10. Big blind folds, but the under the gun limper calls. The turn is an ace of diamonds, putting 2 diamonds on board, which actually hurts our hand in case our opponent has diamonds to go along with whatever he's holding. If our opponent only has a single pair type of holding though, maybe I can steal this pot now? Maybe? Pretty please? I lead again with an overbet to the tune of $50 into the pot of 35, representing 2 pairs at bare minimum. Unfortunately, our opponent calls yet again. He either has some sort of combo draw, or he hit that ace with a hand like ace-6 or ace-8. He could have a hand like 8-10, with or without diamonds as well. So the river comes, and it's a 10 of hearts. We don't improve at all. I'm sitting here with freaking 6 high. But I didn't come all this way to quit now. Up until now, I've repped an absolutely massive hand, so I'm going to continue with that story. I shoot out yet another massive overbet, but to the tune of $225 this time, into the pot of $135. Our opponent doesn't immediately fold, which is daunting. In fact, he tanks for over 30 seconds. Do you wear a cape on the weekends, my friend? You better watch out. I have a natural 9. It's 2 starting cards that add up to 9, and is the absolute best starting hand in Baccarat. In Baccarat, you can only auto-win with a natural 9, or in the worst case scenario, chop with another natural 9. My opponent seems to agree with my logic, so he lets his hand go. Shortly after this hand, the table breaks. And unfortunately, it was the last 2-5 table remaining at the win.
I'm not finished yet. There's more.
In for 1600 and out for 1617 for an amazing profit of 17 doll hairs after 3 hours and 42 minutes of playtime. I don't even bother to record a cash out because it's not like you guys need proof of a $17 win. Hey guys, so in my last video I mentioned if you want to play some online poker you can join me on Telegram. That's because I wasn't sure what YouTube allows or does not allow me to say regarding online poker. I've since been told it should be okay to mention that it's a Club GG club. So if you want to play some online poker with us on Club GG, you can join me in the app, and I'll put the link below. And then we have players like North Cal Poker. He does a meetup every week. And if I get enough people interested, I can also do a meetup once a week or so. So yeah, join me on Telegram and join me on Club GG. The link's below, and I hope to see you guys there. Okay, so now it's time for what you plebs have been waiting for. I normally only play 3 to 4 hour sessions, but if I switch games, it's enough of a mental rest for me to continue playing. It's like when you work out at the gym. Your average healthy person can probably do 10 exercises of multiple sets each without having too hard of a time. But try lifting some heavy weights over your head and holding it there for as long as you can. You're probably going to get exhausted before even hitting the 1 minute mark. It's incredibly hard to keep your muscles flexed without releasing the tension to let the muscles relax. The brain works in the same way. You have to release the tension to let it relax. So while I personally can't play the same game and hope to maintain any level of sanity after anything too much longer than 4 hours, switching up the game gives my brain that much needed break, the break that it requires to continue to function at peak levels. So I figure perhaps it's finally time we record a 1-3 session for the fans. For the fans! Oh, and I'm going to limit myself to a 100 big blind structure as requested. So I hop over to the 1-3 and bind for 300, which is 100 big blinds. We start our session at 3:48 in the morning. 10 minutes into the session, the low jack opens for 15. The hijack calls. Nearly everyone on this table has me covered since I only bought in for $300, and the max buy-in here at the Win Encore is 500 for the 1-3. I stare down at the best possible starting hand. Oh yes, we're talking about American Airlines. Pocket freaking aces. The Jean-Claude Van Damme of mixed martial arts. Oh, you beautiful French bastard. I don't mess around, so I put in a 3-bet to $60 in the cutoff. I'm not about to make a tiny min raise or anything like that, and potentially risk my entire stack to win another $20 or whatever. If you guys play the 1-3, this is my first and only 1-3 vlog so far to date, as I haven't played an entire 1-3 session in like a year. So please pay close attention to my betting and raise amounts, as I might not release another 1-3 vlog in quite some time. So for my 3-bet amount, only the low jack original raiser calls. If everyone had folded, I'd have been fine with that as well. It's better to win a small pot than lose a big one, especially with a hand like pocket aces, where every single flop looks like just undercards to your hand. So the flop comes, and it's King 10 deuce with all hearts. My opponent and I both double check our hands to see if we're carrying that much needed heart. And I'm happy to see that I am indeed holding the ace of hearts. So here my opponent leads for a half pot bet of 65. I'm not all that deep. I think if I just had aces here without the ace of hearts, I would just rip it in. But since I am holding the ace of hearts, I don't need a whole lot of protection. I contemplate between raising and just smooth calling. I'm not a huge fan of slow playing though, like almost ever. And I don't think our opponent is ever folding a king here. So I throw out a very small min raise to 135, leaving myself only 105 left, which is just going in on the turn. Unfortunately, our opponent makes the fold, even to the tiny min raise. Still, we just gained like $140, which is almost a 50% stack increase. Not gonna complain about that. A pretty great start to the session. For this next hand, Under the Gun opens with a very small raise to $9. The middle position, low jack and hijack all call. I'm sitting here staring down at an incredibly weak Queen 4 of diamonds in the cutoff. Usually this is just an easy fold with a garbage hand, but if you watch the vlog regularly, you'll know that I open my range pretty wide when I have position, especially when there are a whole bunch of callers in front of us. So I do put in the call here, but the blinds fold. We go 5 ways in position to flop of 7 Jack Queen with 2 spades and a diamond. We flop top pair with a garbage kicker and a backdoor flush draw. Thankfully, the action checks over to us. Okay, so I'm not about to bet a small amount just because I have a weak hand. You need to be careful never to telegraph the strength of your hand. So here I start with a $30 bet into the pot of 49, which is the same amount I would use if I had a hand like king queen, fully prepared to fold if I meet any sort of resistance in the form of a check raise, same as I would do if I actually had king queen. Thankfully, it doesn't come to that. Everyone folds, and I scoop another decent-sized pot with a garbage hand, but in position. 30 minutes later, everyone folds around to me on the button. I open the action up to $10 with ace-7 of diamonds. Small blind folds, but the big blind calls. The flop comes 5, 4, king, rainbow with 1 diamond. We don't flop anything whatsoever except a random overcard and a few different backdoor draws. However, a king high flop is pretty good for our range as the original raiser, so I rep that king with a larger than normal c-bet to $15. Our opponent checks his cards and then makes the call. Why would he need to check his cards? If he had a king, surely he would have remembered. Maybe he's just checking for his draw, or maybe he's checking to see if his undercard hit the board for 2 pairs. Either way, I don't think he has a very strong hand right now. So the turn comes, and it's one of the best cards we could have hoped for without actually making a single pair. It's a 3 of diamonds, improving our hand from a random airball ace high to a double gut shot straight draw with the backdoor flush draw as well and 1 overcard. Our equity just improved massively. So when our opponent checks, I don't let up and shoot out another 80% pot size bet to $40 into the $50 pot. This is the same size I would choose if I had an actual strong king here. So again, our opponent makes the call. The river is a jack of clubs. We brick out. Our opponent has shown some strength with his calls, but not enough to lead or check raise. At best, he has a weak king of some sort. More preferably, he could have a hand like 5-6, which flopped middle pair and then turned an open-ended draw. We can get a hand like that to fold without too much pressure. We should be able to get most weak kings to fold here as well, with a hand like king 9 and below. So I shoot out another pot-sized bet to the tune of 120. Unfortunately for us, this particular opponent watches the vlogs. He's a subscriber, and his name is Alex, who plays the 1-3 regularly at the Win. He knows I'm very capable of 3-barrel bluffing, in position on a board that favors my range, with complete donkey balls. So he makes the call. I announce ace high, and he flips over king 6 offsuit to own our soul. Great assessment of the situation, Alex. You got me good here. Although, as a note of contention, I would never advise playing such a hand as king 6 offsuit against a raise when you're also out of position. With this substantial loss, we've given up all of our profits, and we're now also stuck $100, so I top off and move on. It's a full 1 hour and 20 minutes before we play our next notable hand. That's almost an hour and a half without a single notable hand to play. Meanwhile, getting a whole lot of donkey balls, diddly squat, or the occasional semi-playable hand like ace-10 offsuit, and then completely missing the flop. It's been over 2 hours since we started this 1-3 session. The pocket aces hand was a great way to start, but we haven't gotten anything afterwards, unless you count winning that small pot with queen 4 suited for crying out loud. But you need patience to play poker profitably, young grasshopper. Your biggest enemy when you're trying to play live poker is boredom. If you get bored, you're way more likely to play terrible starting hands, or make calls with bad pot or implied odds while on a draw. It's because you crave action. You want to feel involved in the game. Without these adrenaline and dopamine rushes, you might be inclined to create the action yourself by raising with mediocre hands. None of these plays are compatible with being a profitable poker player, especially at the 1-3 stakes. So since I haven't been getting any playable hands in the last 2 hours, I decided to switch things up and move seats to the other side of the table. I've actually lost another $100 at this point, so I had to top off for a second time. But I'm only keeping my stack at 100 big blinds to remain within the boundaries of the viewers who've asked for this vlog. We've lost a couple of players at this point, so we're only 6-handed going into this one. Here, under the gun limps. I raise the action up to $10 with king 10 of clubs. Everyone folds, but the small blind and under the gun limper both call. The flop couldn't be much prettier. It's 8-2-10 with 2 clubs and a heart. We flop top pair with a great kicker and also have the second nut flush draw as well. The action checks to me. If I didn't also have clubs here, I'd probably throw out a pretty substantial c-bet to like 25, or even a full pot size bet to like 30. But since I have such an overpowering hand, I only use a half pot size of 15. Small blind calls, but the under the gun limper folds. Their turn comes, and it's a 3 of spades, not changing a whole lot. When our opponent checks it over to us, I use another slightly over half pot sizing of 35. Again, our opponent makes the call. The river is a jack of clubs. We improve to the second nuts, although I don't actually think we needed it. So when our opponent checks for a third time, I can't go too big here. We were most likely already good with our king 10. If we bomb the crap out of this river, we're not going to get called by a naked 10. So on this river, I want to target a naked 10. Meanwhile, get a smaller flush to check raise us. If I use an extremely large size, a naked 10 will fold, and a smaller flush will only just flat call instead of check raising. So I shoot out a meek bet of 50 into the pot of 130. Our opponent says he thinks we have the flush, but he still makes the call. I table our winning hand, and he turns over Jack 10 offsuit for the river 2 pairs. So as it turns out, our opponent's hand was slightly better than we gave him credit for, but he was still putting us on a river flush when he made the call, so he probably wouldn't have called a bet too much bigger. Phew! One of the first hands dealt after my seat change, and I've already won a hand. Maybe things will start to look up. Only 3 minutes later, I open to 15 under the gun with ace-queen offsuit. Here, listen to the original audio as I complain about not getting any winning hands since the start of my session.
I won the first hand. I haven't won anything since. I haven't won a single freaking hand since.
Okay, so for the $15 price point, only the middle position calls, with a stack of close to 300. The flop comes, and it's Jack 7-6 with 2 clubs and a diamond. We don't have anything. And a jack high flop isn't so great for our range as the original raiser, so I start with a check. Our opponent bets half pot for 15, which I recognize is a much weaker than normal bet for such a dynamic board. 1-3 players tend to bet really big when they have a big hand on a board with 2 of a suit, so I decide to float here with 2 random overcards while also holding the queen of clubs. The turn comes, and it's a 7 of clubs, completing the front door flush as well as pairing middle pair. I check again. Again, our opponent throws out a very timid bet of 25. I'm never going to have a 7 here when I raise to 15, which is 5 big blinds in a 1-3 game, but our opponent doesn't need to know that. I think he has just a weak jack here with a hand like Jack 10 or something similar, and he's going to hate to see aggression here. So I put in the good old-fashioned check raise to 100.
Turn raises are so underbluffed in low stakes, so I'm honestly hating this spot.
I have 2 overcards to the jack, and I do have a queen of clubs at this point, but I highly doubt our opponent can face this sort of aggression. I mean, when have you seen a check raise in a 1-3 game on the turn be anything other than a really nutted hand?
Like I said earlier, turn raises are super underbluffed at the low stakes, especially when a player who I haven't seen bluff all day tries to pull it off.
Against your typical 1-3 player, a turn check raise will almost never be done as a bluff or a semi-bluff. But Aero is not your typical 1-3 player, and I love to capitalize when I notice weakness. Only 20 minutes later, I finally have an actual premium hand for crying out loud. Maybe there's something to be said about this seat changing thing after all. My mama always said, when you gamble, you only get lucky or you no get lucky. If you have bad luck, eat some duck to change your luck, or you can eat some dried squid too. But never go to gamble if the first person you see is a woman. Ayya, they bad luck. Ayya, 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 ayya. So here the low jack opens to 15. The hijack calls. I 3-bet to 55 on the button with pocket kings. My least favorite premium starting hand. They did well for me earlier tonight, so maybe they can do the trick for me here too. I'd actually won a few hands since the seat change, so I'm sitting here with a modest stack of just over 500 right now. Listen to my original audio as I try to throw my opponents off with why I'm 3-betting.
Replay. Wait, that's a re-raise to 55.
I don't think he meant it.
I'm not judging if he
I
meant
have
it.
the button though.
Just kidding. Yeah. Oh, that's why.
Yeah. One of those types of hands.
Yeah.
So for my $55 raise, everyone folds. But Alex, who only just smooth called the original $15 raise, puts in the back 4-bet raise to 200 with a stack of over 800 that covers me. Music to my ears. The trap has been set with the befuddlement spell I cast while pretending to only raise on the button, and now that it's been sprung, nothing to do here but reel in the catch. I shove all in for my remaining stack of just over 500. It's about 300 more and some change for Alex to call. He thinks about his options for a moment, but does eventually put in the calling chips. I verbally let him know that I have pocket kings. Okay, so you guys already know this, but this is my least favorite premium starting hand. I only just got even for the day, rebuilding my stack back to 500 after topping off twice. We need to avoid a freaking ace on this flop, which we already know is most likely coming. But if you guys pause the video for a moment and take a second to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, maybe we can avoid the train wreck we already know is coming. Come on guys, please smash that like button real quick. I already know an ace is hitting this flop since I'm editing this video, but maybe you as the viewer can cause a butterfly effect which will unleash a chain of events that change the cards to come. Okay, so the flop comes, and it's Queen, 2, King, Rainbow. We flop top freaking set to most likely have our opponent drawing to runner with extremely few outs. Holy crap! You guys did it! You changed the future! The turn is a 2 of hearts, pairing the board and giving us the check mark against just about every hand, and the river is an inconsequential jack of clubs. Alex is nice enough to show what he made the play with as he flips over his hand to reveal ace queen of hearts. Thanks for being a good sport, Alex. For the last hand of the night, Alex opens to 12 on the button. Small blind calls. Button open raises against the blinds can be extremely wide, so I decide to defend my big blind for $9 more with King 10 off suit. The flop comes 10, 6, 8, Rainbow. We flop top pair with a very good kicker. Small blind checks. I decide to lead here with a bet of 25 into the pot of $36 to find out where I'm at. There are a lot of pair and gutshot draws out there, plus we want to deny equity against random overcards. Alex makes the call on the button, but the small blind folds. The turn brings in a jack of diamonds, putting 2 diamonds on board. Queen 9 makes the nuts. We've been demoted to second pair, and it's not like our hand is super strong or anything, so I check for pot control. Thankfully, Alex checks the action back. The river brings in a 3 of clubs, not changing a whole lot. If we were ahead on the flop, we should still be ahead now. I think if our opponent had a hand like Jack Queen, which was a gutshot draw on the flop with 2 overcards, he would have bet already when that Jack hit the turn. So I go for a slightly under half pot bet of 40 for value. Alex makes the fold, showing that he called the flop with an 8 of hearts. After this hand, I play for one more orbit before racking up and calling it a night, since I'd already played for 4 hours of 2-5 before coming to the 1-3 table. In for 500 and out for 1124 for a respectable profit of $624 after 3 hours and 2 minutes of playtime. I wish I had more hands to feature for the 1-3 portion of this vlog, but not a whole lot happened to be honest. I attempted a couple of bluffs, got caught in one, and got away with another, and I just had the one big hand with the pocket kings. You don't need to do anything crazy to be profitable in the 1-3. Just play the better hand ranges. Bet appropriately, 80 to 100% pot most of the time, and know when you have to fold good hands if you face too much aggression. Hopefully I'll be able to release another 1-3 vlog in the future, but I hope you enjoyed what you saw today. Just remember that impatience and boredom are probably your 2 biggest enemies at the 1-3 stakes. Practice good bet sizing, fold mediocre hands, capitalize on good position. And if you're looking for more tips and tricks on how to crush low stakes, no limit hold'em, come check out my Patreon and support the channel. There, for a modest fee, you can get access to all the coaching videos that I've released so far. And as always, I hope to see you in the next video.